So my wife over here is actually working right now as a nurse over at Sharp Grossmont. And part of her job as a nurse is that she advocates for her patients. She hears the patient's needs and what they're doing, and then tells the doctor what needs to be ordered. The doctor evaluates the situations, makes the appropriate prescriptions, and then my wife takes those orders and makes sure that she delivers them correctly. For her job, delivering the medication correctly is really important. In fact, in school for nursing, you have to get 100% on your math test because you don't want to mess up those ratios. It is critical to preach for them to do the message correctly. Similarly, when Paul here in Romans emphasizes this idea of the gospel, he wants us to know that we need to preach the gospel accurately. And for him, this introduction kind of launches him into a long dissertation, a long logical argument of saying, here's what the gospel is to make sure everyone's on the same page. So for us particularly, there's a couple ways that we can consider this. We want to preach the gospel accurately by not adding to it, by not diluting it, but also by preaching it confidently. So let's consider that in this passage. As already been stated, Romans 1 is the introduction. It is the purpose statement here in the book. After saying who it's from and who it's to, this is why he wrote the book. So if you're ever lost somewhere in Romans and saying, why is he bringing this up? Backtrack to this purpose statement because it'll help keep you on track. So I want to start in verse 15 to show his eagerness to preach the gospel accurately. Verse 15. So as much as it is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. For I am not ashamed of Christ, of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So first, in his preaching of the gospel accurately, he wants to make sure that things don't get added to it. You see the logical arguments that is being made when he uses that word for. So he's not ashamed to preach the gospel. And the reason that is it's the power of God to salvation. And the reason that it's the power of God's salvation is because faith is what he requires. So the first thing that we need to know is that we are justified and saved by faith. And we don't need to add anything to that. We shouldn't try to add works to the gospel of Jesus. When you were a kid and you got in trouble, you temporarily kind of fell out of favor or fell out of grace with your parents. They still loved you, but you knew that things weren't right until things were resolved. You needed to either make restitution or sit in time out long enough until things were made right. The problem with us and God is that there's no way we can make that payment. The wages of sin, or what we earn from it, is death. We cannot pay that on our own. So it takes Jesus perfectly changing our positions, making us right with God again, justified, just as if I'd never sinned, making us right before God again. So we take his place as if we are Jesus standing before God. That is what he aimed to do. So adding works to that takes away from the glory that God gets for doing the entire process of saving us. When we preach the gospel, we want to make sure that we preach it in a way that does not bring glory to us for any earnings that we do, that it brings full glory to what God has done. In Ephesians 2, Paul references how it's not a work that we do or a thing that we can boast about. There's no boasting that's to be had. So when we preach the gospel, let's not add things that we do to it. But also, we don't want to dilute the message of the gospel. In diluting it, sometimes we try to take away the power that it has by making it easier for people to hear. In this case, he says that justification comes by faith. That word faith is critical to understand. Often it can get diluted to the idea of just a mental assent. If you say the right words, if you say the right prayer, you'd be saved. But I don't believe that's what God is looking for. I don't think he's looking for certain sound waves to come out of our mouth. He's looking for a heart change. He's looking for a posture that says he is Lord. Dr. Pete Goodman is a pastor, an interim pastor over here at Rise City Church here in Lakeside. And he wrote a book called Like Stars. In it, he describes what faith is. His doctoral work was actually around the word pistis, faith, that described the cultural background. And so he defines faith like this. He says, it is an active, lived out lifestyle of trusting Jesus and following his lead in response to the amazing grace poured out upon us undeserving sinners. Now, at first, that could sound like we're adding a work to the gospel, that if faith is something that you do, we've added to it. And it's important that we should recognize this is a difficult concept. But if faith is just a mental assent, we don't get the accuracy of what it is that saves us. Rather, it is a declaration that says, Jesus is now my Lord. That whatever he does, wherever he goes, I believe in that and I will follow him wherever he goes. It'd be like with the disciples getting out of the boat, leaving everything behind and following Jesus. So for us, we don't have to get out of a boat, but it does mean that we need to say, no matter what Jesus says is right and wrong, his answer is what matters. So we follow him in that way. And so finally, when we get to the idea of preaching the gospel accurately, we hear that we need to preach it confidently. Paul says that he is not ashamed of the gospel. And that brought to my mind, why would somebody be ashamed of the gospel? If it is the power of salvation, what is there to be ashamed of? But part of the difficulty is that it's hard to tell people that they're not right with God. It's not a comfortable message. When a doctor comes in and says that somebody has cancer, that's difficult and hard news. But it's necessary. Because if they just said, here's a prescription to make your life better, the person wouldn't take it because they don't see a need. The gospel first must be met with the uncomfortable news that we're all not in right standing with God. If you ask the common person on the street, they just say we're a good person. And the truth is, we might be good people if we look around to the people next to us, right? We could always compare to somebody worse off than us. But if we're asked, are you as good as God? Then we might be a little bit more humble because that's the standard that he demands of us. That is the standard of what it means to be in right relationship and right standing with God. And so we need to be administrators of the gospels in that way. Paul's about to spend the next 3 chapters telling them all the ways that we are all fallen sinners, from homosexuality to legalism and people who are upright and trying to show off that they're better hypocrites. All of it's sin. All of it makes us out of right standing for God. And so we need to be bold enough and unashamed to tell people they are sinners. And it should be clear, we should do that in a graceful, Christ-like way. No doctor goes into a patient's room and says, you have cancer and happy about it. That's wrong. We should not get any boast of saying, well, because I'm right, I can just tell them off for their sins. No, it's the doctor saying, here, let me come in and administer the grace. And before you get the answer, you need to know the problem. So we need to be humble in how we speak the gospel clearly. So in summary, I want us to consider how we preach the gospel in such a way that gives people the medicine that they need, the accuracy of the gospel. The gospel is the power of God to salvation. He alone is able to save. So let's not add to it. Let's not add good works or any merits of our own that brings and takes away the glory from him. But let's also not dilute the gospel. The gospel requires action. It requires an eagerness to follow Christ. And it requires us to do something about it. That's not a work. That's saying my heart needs to follow God. And the beauty about faith alone by justification by faith alone is that if we do that imperfectly, his grace covers that. That's part of the process of us growing in our following of him. And then finally, we need to preach the gospel boldly. While there could be things that make that difficult, we need to make sure that we don't dilute the gospel in that way and try to avoid the circumstances to say things in a way that makes people feel happy. They need to know that there's a problem, and then they can get the solution. So let's preach the gospel accurately.